In Book 7 of the Republic by Plato, Socrates presents the most beautiful and famous allegory in Western philosophy, the allegory of the cave. The word allegory comes from the Latin allegoria, meaning speaking to imply something else. An allegory represents a larger point about society or human nature through a simple story in which different characters may represent real life figures. Sometimes situations in the story may echo stories from history or modern day life without ever explicitly stating this connection. Allegories are similar to metaphors in that both illustrate an idea by making a comparison to something else. However, allegories are complete stories with characters, while metaphors are brief figures of speech. This allegory of the cave is a Socratic dialogue recorded by Greek philosopher Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates and one of the few people to write down some of his many teachings, which were eventually compiled into their own books. The Republic is one such book containing the allegory of the cave, a dialogue between Socrates and Plato's brother Glaucon. As presented by Plato, Socrates' allegory of the cave imagines a group of people who have lived in a deep cave since birth, never seeing the light of day. These people are bound so that they cannot look to either side or behind them, but only straight ahead. Behind them is a fire, and behind the fire is a partial wall. On top of the wall are various statues, which are manipulated by another group of people lying out of sight behind the partial wall. Because of the fire, the statues cast shadows across the wall that the prisoners are facing. The prisoners watch the stories that these shadows play out, and because these shadows are all they ever get to see, they believe them to be the most real things in the world. When they talk to one another about men, women, trees, or horses, they are referring to these shadows. These prisoners represent the lowest stage on the line, imagination. Then a prisoner is freed from his bonds and is forced to look at the fire and at the statues themselves. After an initial period of pain and confusion because of direct exposure of his eyes to the light of the fire, the prisoner realizes that what he sees now are things more real than the shadows he has always taken to be reality. He grasps how the fire and the statues together cause the shadows, which are copies of these more real things. He accepts the statues and fire as the most real things in the world. This stage in the cave represents belief. He has made contact with real things, the statues, but he is not aware that there are things of greater reality, a world beyond his cave. Next, this prisoner somehow gets out of the cave into the world above. At first, he is so dazzled by the light up there that he can only look at shadows, then at reflections, then finally at the real objects, real trees, real flowers, houses, and so on. He sees that these are even more real than the statues were, and that those were only copies of these. He has now reached the cognitive stage of thought. He has caught his first glimpse of the most real things, the forms. If you're not aware of what the forms are, I made a video on Plato's theory of the forms. Anyway, when the prisoner's eyes have fully adjusted to the brightness, he lifts his sight toward the heavens and looks at the sun. He understands that the sun is the cause of everything he sees around him. The light, his capacity for sight, the existence of flowers, trees, and other objects. The sun represents the form of the good, and the former prisoner has reached the stage of understanding. Plato uses the cave as a symbolic representation of how human beings live in the world, contrasting reality versus our interpretation of it. These two ideas reflect the two worlds in the story: the world inside the cave and the world outside. For the prisoners in the cave, the shadows on the wall created by firelight are all they know to be real. If one of the prisoners breaks free and witnesses the outside world, they will come to understand that as the true reality. However, when the freed prisoner returns to the darkness of the cave, their eyes will have now been blinded by the light of the sun, and their fellow prisoners still inside the cave will believe that it is the outside world that is harmful. To them, that truth is not worth seeking. The allegory delves into the philosophical thought of truth and how those with different experiences or backgrounds may perceive it. The shadows on the wall of the cave are constantly changing, so there is no stability or consistency offered for those who bear witness to them, only a false reality. They have no knowledge that the real world exists outside of their dark cave, or even that there is a real world other than their own. Meanwhile, the person who has left the cave will not be able to exist as they once did. In fact, they may even come to pity or feel superior to those who remain in the cave. The allegory essentially demonstrates the conflicts between knowledge and belief and what happens to a person once they've been enlightened. It is an examination on the nature of humanity and fear of the unknown. This allegory of the cave is also meant to illustrate the effects of education on the human soul. Education moves the philosopher through stages on the divided line and ultimately brings him to the form of the good. The goal of education is to drag every man as far out of the cave as possible. Education should not aim at putting knowledge into the soul, but at turning the soul toward right desires. Continuing the analogy between mind and sight, Socrates explains that the vision of a clever, wicked man might be just as sharp as that of a philosopher. The problem lies in what he turns his sharp vision toward. The overarching goal of the city is to educate those with the right natures so that they can turn their minds sharply toward the form of the good. Once they have done this, they cannot remain contemplating the form of the good forever. They must return periodically into the cave and rule there. They need periodically to turn away from the forms to return to the shadows to help other prisoners. Since the stages in the cave are stages of life, it seems fair to say that Plato thought that we must all proceed through the lower stages in order to reach the higher stages. Everyone begins at the cognitive level of imagination. We each begin our lives deep within the cave, with our head and legs bound, and education is the struggle to move as far out of the cave as possible. Not everyone can make it all the way out, which is why some people are producers, some warriors, and some philosopher kings.